Hello, this is Chuck Hardwick Jr., and today is April 8th, 2020. I'm in San Diego, and my dad is at his home in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. This is the second of a series of interviews with my dad. So we'll give him just a second to pop in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. There he is. How are you doing today, Dad?
Good morning, Chuck. It's early your time. It's about 11 o'clock my time.
Looks like a nice day there in South Florida.
Another beautiful day.
Great.
Another day in paradise.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And so, Dad, today I want you to update us on the coronavirus pandemic, and then we'll focus on the period in your life between 1949 and 1952.
Okay, Chuck, I appreciate this opportunity to talk to you and to anyone else who would listen to the program. First of all, we, like everyone else, hunkered down for the virus. We're doing fine. Plenty of food, swimming pool, and it's actually been very restful, stressful, but restful at the same time. But a couple of observations I would share. One of them is what makes it so insidious about this virus is that if you're moving around and you have 100 opportunities to be exposed to the virus, and you do everything exactly right 99 times, and then you forget to wipe a doorknob, or you do one thing that you shouldn't have done, and you could get the virus. So it's 99% is a good score on most school exams. But in fighting the virus, it's like fighting a terrorist. You have to do everything possible to be 100% effective. So that's this one, not profound, but one thought that I had about it. And the other thing about the virus, this whole pandemic that's really bothered me, I wish that President Trump and the media from this point out could bury the hatchet long enough that the press briefings we have can focus on the things that we American people need to know to protect our families and ourselves, and what's happening with the pandemic and what should be done about it, and stop the back and forth vitriolic exchanges. Some members of the media, CNN and others, it's clear from the interviews that they're having that they focus, what can they find wrong? What can they criticize about what the Trump administration is doing? And he's at fault. He calls on them and jumps on them and calls them names, and they go back and forth. So there's fault on both sides. I don't like that. That's not, the animosity is not helping anyone. And when this is all over, there'll be commissions and reviews of what went right, what went wrong, who didn't do something, who did the wrong thing. That's fine. That can be settled. But in the meantime, stop the arguing, stop the name calling, and just give us the facts. So that's really kind of irritating me. So I thought I'd get that off my chest.
Well, thanks for sharing that. And so let's get back to your life. And so you had mentioned that your mother had passed away. So my grandpa, he was actually a working single parent, wasn't he?
He was. And your granddad, my dad, was a really fine man, worked hard all of his life. And at that period of time, after my mother died, I stayed with my grandmother until I was ready, until the summer before the first grade. And I remember that very well. She was a great lady. I think I showed her picture in the previous session that we had. And I remember those days rather fondly. That whole time period, my dad being a single dad, selling insurance, Fanny and Joe and David were so important to me. Joe was in Louisville, working at the time. He would come home on weekends. I remember his coming in a new Studebaker automobile. You probably have never seen a Studebaker car, a new car that came down. He would take me with him on weekends out to play tennis at the Somerset High School tennis court. And up at the First Methodist Church, they had tennis courts. Would take us down to Lake Cumberland to swim. Lake Cumberland, in the meantime, I remember from my childhood, being in the town of Burnside, and the Army Corps of Engineers blocked up the Cumberland River. and had it back up and eventually flooded out all of old Burnside. But yet it created a tremendous lake and is today a terrific place for recreation, vacations and fishing and all kinds of good things. But Joe would take us down and we would go swimming. He was always showing interest in me. He was always there when I needed him, always with the good advice. Fanny was really a surrogate mother. And I have a strong memory of Fanny holding me and over our mother's coffin, the casket. The funeral was held at our home, I recall that. And Fanny holding me, and she became a surrogate mother. And in fact, I was her little baby brother until she died many years later. David was my buddy. He took good care of me as an older brother. He and I were very close, playing baseball. Uh, he had a girlfriend then. I remember my best friend was Jack Ruffner, and David's girlfriend was Judy Ruffner. And in the backyard of our tree, back there we had a large tree and had a basketball hoop on it. And David had carved BH plus JR out of that tree, and used to tease him about that a lot. So those were really interesting times that we had. And that was before my dad got remarried, which came as kind of a big shock and change in our family life when that occurred.
So time-wise, this is right around when the Korean War started. Is that right?
That's right. Yes, it was. And my memory of the Korean War, I remember David explaining to me while we were going to war that one country was coming in to take over another country, and they were fighting about it, and America was going to help the other country. Another memory I had of the Korean War was kids that in the neighborhood going down to an Army Navy store and buying all kinds of Army gear. We had authentic water bottles and hats and meals. I remember bars of chocolate and bars of coffee you could break up and make instant coffee. They were all Army rations that somehow got into the private system. I remember comic books. I can still see pictures of Chinese soldiers coming over a hill, charging American soldiers who were fighting them. So a lot of those memories. I didn't really understand communism or North Korea and everything, what it was about. I knew that there was a war underway, and our soldiers were over there fighting.
Interesting. And so Granddad got remarried, and that brought a whole new step family into the.
It did.
Tell us about the step family.
Well, I remember when Dad and Lola started. Her name was Lola Watson, and they started dating. And I remember Dad taking me, and she had 3 children, one my age, one just a little older than me, her name was Pat, taking the 4 of us, Dad and Lola and Pat and me, to drive-in movies. And then next thing I know, Dad and Lola got married, and Dad quit his job selling insurance. And Lola, he had met, she'd been either a wait person or something, maybe a cook in a restaurant. And they decided to open up a restaurant down in Burnside on Route 27, kind of a restaurant truck stop. It was called the Halfway House because it was halfway between Cincinnati and Chattanooga, Tennessee, I think, something along those lines. So we moved down in the 5th grade. I went from the Somerset 5th grade down to the Burnside 5th grade. David was in high school, and he, I know, continued going to Somerset High School. And Fanny at that time had just left to attend Berea College. And I remember Joe coming down to visit and checking everything out. I enjoyed that experience. It was pretty interesting, but the restaurant didn't succeed, like so many restaurants. And somewhere around the end of the 5th grade, the restaurant folded, things got bad. Dad and Lola separated, and Dad sold insurance for a while, health insurance. We moved in with my grandmother, and then Dad left to go to Akron, Ohio, where my brother Joe was working, and invited Dad to come up. And he stayed with Joe and Evelyn for a while. while he was looking for work. And then I stayed with my grandmother and entered the sixth grade at Parker School. And that was an interesting switch for me. The teacher there was Mrs. I think wasn't forgotten her name, Mrs. Hollis, and Fanny knew her because Mrs. Hollis had a daughter who was a good friend with Fanny, and I enjoyed the sixth grade quite a bit, and I guess I was kind of the teacher's pet. It was a rough neighborhood though. Had kids picking on me. I was a little guy, and I remember when I first went there, some boys took me out. There's a big knob hill not far from the school, and we had to fight. I had to fight, and I did. I defended myself, okay, and after that they left me alone. But we engaged in things like tossing pennies, or you toss a penny or a nickel up to the wall, and whoever get the closest, one for both. And we would match pennies. You'd each have a stack, and you'd have heads, or you'd have match or not match, and you'd each show your penny. And if you had match and both heads or both tails, you won. If one was you had not match and they didn't match, then that person won. Kinds of weird games that we played back then. But at the end of the sixth grade, then Dad had found a job working for Wonder Bread, and he had found an apartment. And Joe came down, God bless him, with his car, and loaded the car up with my stuff. And Joe and Evelyn and I then drove to Akron, Ohio. So just happen to have a picture here. This is a picture of me and my stepmother, Lola. I don't know if you can see that very clearly.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, hold it right there. That's perfect. Oh, that's a great picture. So that's Lola, your stepmother. And that's the halfway house?
That's the halfway house behind us. That was in February of 1952.
And did they put you to work? Were you a busboy or washing dishes or anything?
Well, I don't think I was capable of doing very much, but I have some memories of being in the kitchen. I was fascinated. We had French fries. We had a French fry cutter, and you took the peelings off, and you put the whole potato in a cutter thing, and then you threw a handle this way, and it pushed it through the blades, and out came perfectly cut French fries. I don't know if they still use that kind of thing today or not.
I bet they were pretty good. They must have been pretty good French fries. That sounds very fresh.
Oh, they were very fresh, no question about that. And then I've got another picture. This picture was in front of my grandmother's house, and the back of it says Thanksgiving in 1952. And I'm a little puzzled. I guess this was, February 52 would have been before Thanksgiving, but it has Fanny and Joe, my dad, and David.
So you were maybe 11.
That sounds about right. Can you?
No, move it over to there we go. Right there. Yeah, there you go. So you were about 11, and that was whose house is that?
That's in front of my grandmother's house.
Grandmother's house. Okay.
Right.
That's a great picture. Now, during this time period, did Aunt Fanny get married? When did Aunt Fanny get married?
Yes, she did get married, and I would show you that picture, but the picture is a huge picture. Everybody lined up and all of the family. Gene Dillard got married that summer and at Berea College and in the chapel there. I remember going to the wedding. I remember being there with Tom Jasper, my cousin, and we thought it was the neatest thing because they were going to come out and you're supposed to throw rice. And so we had handfuls of rice, and instead of nice tossing, I remember we were throwing it hard because when else could you throw rice at your big sister and get away with it, you know? But Dillard and Fanny got married. Dillard had visited our house during the summer, and I remember him well in the backyard playing ball with me. And I also remember we had a dumbbell weight. I don't know how much it weighed. I know for me it was really heavy, probably 10 pounds or so. But I was so impressed that Dillard was out in the backyard and he could lift that weight, you know, with either arm. while he was playing with me. So he was certainly welcomed into the family. And at that point, he graduated from Berea and had gone to Rhode Island to officers candidate school. And I think he had completed it. And if I'm not mistaken, in his wedding pictures, he's wearing his officer's dress uniform. It looked mighty spiffy.
So let's talk about Uncle David during that time period. So you were living in Burnside, and then you moved back to Somerset in, I think you said, the 6th grade. What do you remember? Well, you told us a little bit about that experience, but was Uncle David, was he in high school, or where was he at that point?
David was still in high school. I think he may have been a senior in that year. I'm not sure exactly, but he was living with grandmothers with me while Dad was there briefly, and then Dad was gone. David was an awfully good big brother. He had his hands full at the time. I'm sure he was worried about everything that was going on, and he may have gotten a job working at. In fact, he did. At the dairy where they made ice cream. And he was working behind the dairy counter, because I remember him talking about he was entitled as working at the counter to make milkshakes. And he was making chocolate milkshakes for himself and putting a fresh egg in it for nutrition. And it was really a lot of fun. I mean, we didn't have much money, but I don't think we missed it all that much. My grandmother would prepare the dinner, and Stella was working at the department store, and she had a telephone, and she would phone her grocery orders in, and then I remember a grocery truck delivering whatever the day's orders were. Not sure how many times a week it came, but kind of an interesting circle coming all the way around to people having groceries delivered today. It was too hard for Grandma to get to the store, and she and Aunt Stella didn't have a car, so they weren't the only people. So groceries would be delivered. They have good Southern cooking, I recall, with cornbread and beans and fried chicken and that kind of thing.
Well, that's interesting. Grocery delivery has really made a comeback during this pandemic, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. That's what I meant. The full circle.
Full circle.
What seems so new? Oh, what a great idea! Well, it's a pretty old idea.
Gotcha. It's still early here. I'm still waking up, so I'm a little slow on the uptake. But so take us through this time period. So at the end of the 6th grade, I think you said you moved up to Akron, Ohio. What was that? That must have been a big change for you. What was that like?
Oh, that was amazing. That was really amazing. We moved into an apartment on the 2nd floor of a large old house. And at that point then, our stepmother and dad had gotten together. So of her 3 children, the oldest one is Donald. And then Barbara was next. And then Pat was more my age. And it was an amazing change of pace. I made a new best friend, George Henry Birch the third, and known as Hank, and we became very good friends. In fact, I came out, and I remember going out in the street to play ball or something, and he asked me my name, and I said, Charlie Hardwick. And he said, Charlie? He said, that'll never cut it. He said, no. He said, from now on, you're Chuck.
Oh, wow.
And I said, okay, and that's I started going by Chuck. But I'd never seen a skyscraper, and not that Akron had the kind of skyscrapers I later saw in New York, but downtown Akron was such a big change from Somerset, Kentucky. The Palace Theater was just grand. In the 7th grade, they had, my goodness, the ceiling had stars, and they'd have an intermission, and some organist would come up out of the floor and play an organ for a while. It was Chick Kurt or something like that, if I recall. So that was a whole new environment, new people. We were living near across from St. Vincent's grade school and high school. Many of my friends, including Hank, were Roman Catholics and went to St. Vincent's. And we lived there for a long time in that neighborhood. Hank and I remained friends all through junior high, for sure, through the 9th grade. And then it was a lot of fun. I started playing on the junior high teams, basketball team. We became big Cleveland Indians fans rather than Cincinnati Reds fans. Started reading the Akron Beacon Journal, and when we would get a newspaper, my dad was working and walking over to Wonder Bread and had a job there. There was a little neighborhood store right around the corner, and then another one across the street. Small stores back then, but they were very convenient, and there was not a supermarket nearby, and we didn't have a car, so we didn't really do much supermarket shopping. But on payday, which I think was Friday, my dad would walk down to the store from the bakery and load up on bags of groceries, and then have a cab bring him and the groceries home. And on weekends, the food was always good. The big meal would sometimes be Sunday morning, where Lola would fry chicken and have for breakfast fried chicken, sliced tomatoes, eggs, and homemade biscuits, and that kind of Southern cooking.
Oh, stop it. You're making me hungry now.
Yeah, well, it makes me hungry.
Sounds pretty good.
Makes me hungry thinking back on it.
Let me ask you about baseball. So you were a big Cincinnati Reds fan. They were in the National League, right? At that point.
Right.
And then you moved to Akron, and everyone's a Cleveland Indians fan, and they were in the American League. So you could root for both teams, because back then they didn't have interleague play unless they both ended up in the World Series. So you could still really root for both teams, couldn't you? Well, it looks like we may be having...
And the Indians.
I was saying the internet started acting up there for a second. So I was asking you about the...
I heard you about the Indians. Yeah,
yes.
I heard you. In fact, I think in the 7th or 8th grade, the Cleveland Indians went to the World Series. And it was such a big deal at West Junior High. They would have an assembly with a big black and white TV up on the stand, and let students out of class come and watch the Indians play in the World Series. So that was quite an experience. It was a while before I really liked West Junior High, and it was quite a while before Joe took me up to Cleveland, actually to see the Indians. And I have a picture which on the back says Charlie, 12 years old, 7th grade, West Junior High School. So that was probably written by Joe.
That's a great picture.
That was the school picture from the 7th grade.
So that's interesting. Let's talk about Chuck versus Charlie, because I realize now you've gone by Chuck, but your family, they still call you Charlie. So that Charlie didn't go away. It's just your friends started calling you Chuck. Is that right?
Right. Well, and then not to jump too far ahead, when I ran for public office, I could be listed on the ballot as Charles Hardwick or Chuck Hardwick. And I think that was in the era of Jimmy Carter, and he wasn't James Earl Carter, he was Jimmy. So I think that's why I went with Chuck. And then that later went on to the Chuck wagon and other things. But that's getting ahead of our stories. So I went to West Junior High, and that was really an eye-opening experience for me in several ways. One of the early experiences that I met there, I'd never known any African-American children. The school was segregated in Somerset. It never occurred to us being a problem or anything. We were just pretty much oblivious, and we didn't have as many African-Americans in our community at large as some southern states did, some other southern towns of comparable size. So it was my first exposure, and two memories struck me very strongly. One of them was I recall some black kids starting to pick on me as I was walking to school. It wasn't that far of a walk, maybe a mile or so. And another black kid stopped him and came over and said, leave this boy alone. He's new in the school. You shouldn't be pushing him around, or whatever they were doing. And yeah, I said, that was pretty nice. That was my first kind of introduction, to that environment. And then in class, I remember I'm trying to remember their names, but there were African-American boys twins who were among the smartest kids I'd ever been in school with. I wish their names might come back to me. I've forgotten their names, but they were really excellent students and very, very smart. And they kind of, I hate to say it, but surprised me because of the stereotypes that I'd always heard. And they were really good. They were really good students. So it changed my perspective quite a bit.
Well, let me interrupt
small
because
town.
I had
Sure.
a thought on that. It's almost that you moved from the South to the North. I mean, was the Mason-Dixon line maybe was right around there, but living in a segregated community and then moving up to Ohio where it was integrated, that was really a move from Southern culture to Northern culture at that time. Is that right, or is that
Well,
close?
on in the aspect of segregated schools, yes. I honestly don't remember whether or not restaurants were segregated. I don't remember when my dad ran that restaurant. They probably were, but I didn't have a memory. But the racial animosities that were really deep in the deep South, and that I encountered 4 years or 6 years later when I went to Tallahassee to go to Florida State, they didn't exist in Kentucky. You recall during the war, Kentucky was a border state, and there were slaves in the pretty much the western part of the state over by the Mississippi River, which was more farmlands. In the center and eastern part of the state uh, was actually Republican, and maybe that was a carryover from the Civil War, as opposed to being Democrats, which really aligned with the Southern Democrats later on in our country's history. So yes, it was a change, but it wasn't as dramatic for me as maybe a child relocating from perhaps Mississippi or Alabama or someplace where, as I discovered when I went to Florida State, the whole issue of race just laid on people's minds every day. It's just an issue all constantly, almost kind of like the pandemic is right now. Hard to shake race away. It seemed to permeate everything that we did. But West Junior High, I found out later, was sort of an experiment that Akron tried. The neighborhood that we lived in was a lower middle class neighborhood, blue collar, and there was areas west of us which were really upscale financially, and they drew school districts which really encompassed a mixture of blue collar and really upscale neighborhoods, far more affluent areas. As an example of that, I remember I had a pretty good friend, and he invited me. He said he was having a party, and he invited me to his house. And I went out to his house, and I was stunned. They had a swimming pool, and big cars and big yards and everything, totally unlike our neighborhood. And then he eventually, after the ninth grade, I know he didn't go to the local high school. He went away to a private boarding school or something. So it was an interesting mixture. And I learned later that Akron took some of their very best teachers and put into West Junior High to try this kind of an experimental program. I don't know how they judge it, but I found it to be a really good school. In the seventh grade, I was a patrol boy, which the Automobile Association used to give kids like a white belt and a badge, and your job was to go out and help kids cross the street. Now we pay people, we pay adults to do that.
Oh, I did the
Sure.
same. I did the same thing in Westfield, going to Tamaqua Elementary
Oh,
School. I was
were
a
you?
safe. They called it the safety patrol, and it was an orange
Oh,
belt. But
okay,
I would help the younger kids cross the street. So
okay.
these days, I think
I
it's
didn't recall
adults.
that.
But yeah.
Yeah, adults do it now. I didn't recall that. So that was the seventh grade, and then the summer of the seventh grade, my stepsister Barbara and I took a bus back to Somerset, where I visited for the summer, or for part of it at least. And then one of the great memories of that period, and I don't know where God bless them, where they got the money to do this, but my Aunt Stella took me to Cincinnati by train and then put me on a train to go to Norfolk, Virginia to see Fanny.
Wow.
And then she took the train back to Somerset.
And how old were you? You were like 12 or
I guess
13?
I was 12. I was between the seventh
So
and eighth
12 or
grade,
13. Yeah.
something like that.
Pretty
And
young
but
guy.
I still remember that train ride. I remember going into the bar car, which was at the very tail end, and the African American waiter with a white coat on and everything asked me what I wanted. I ordered a ginger ale and looked out the window and stayed on the train until I got to Norfolk, and Fanny was there to meet me. How they lined all that up, things were a lot harder to get done then, but it was a wonderful experience. And so I spent the rest of the summer with Fanny. Dillard was at sea, and Fanny took me to Washington D.C.
Wow.
To see the sights there. We sort of broke into the home of our cousin. Aunt Mabel's daughter was living there, and sort of crashed on him. I don't know if Fanny told them we were coming or not, but I really enjoyed that experience. We had a cab driver who became kind of a tour guide around Washington and took Fanny and me around. And then we went back to Norfolk, and Dillard came home. He'd been on tour. He came home, and Fanny and he were living in an upstairs apartment. Forgotten their landlord's name. I used to know it. And I spent the rest of the summer there. Great time. I remember how happy they were to see each other. And I don't know, that may have been when Dill Jr. was conceived, if I recall. They spent a lot of time together. I remember Fanny giving me money to walk down to the movie theater by myself, I guess, so they could be alone. And I remember fishing for fish, caught some fish, and I had them on a hook down in the water in Norfolk. They had canals coming into someplace where I was. I'm not sure exactly, but I went to pull my fish up, and there's crabs hanging on. They'd been eating the fish, and the crabs dropped off, and I thought, darn, I didn't know that I couldn't do that. And so my fish were gone. Fanny took me to the officers' club at the Navy. Dillard was in the Navy. We ate aboard his ship, the USS Mole, which I thought was pretty cool. And I watched the Navy pilots taking off, the Navy Air Force. Very impressed by that. And then, not to jump too far ahead, later I interviewed and nearly joined the Navy to be an Air Force pilot. It turned out I was my build, though I always wish I was taller. They actually like shorter people, smaller guys, but because you could fit into the cockpit better. Those cockpits were not very big, but you couldn't be a big, bulking guy and be in a fighter jet. There's just not enough room. They didn't people to be moved, so they kind of wanted me. And then I remember Joe and Evelyn came down and visited with Fanny for a while. And then Joe drove me home back to Akron. So think of all that planning. My Aunt Stella, my sister Fanny, Joe, Evelyn, Dillard, and everyone involved. And it was a great summer for me. I still remember it. I remember the movie I think it was called The Tender Trap with Frank Sinatra and Debbie Reynolds. And Debbie Reynolds, I fell in love with, like 12-year-old boys can. She was about 20 at the time. And many years later, I met her when I was the Speaker of the House, and she was performing for the Medical Society of New Jersey at a fundraiser. And I went to that dinner, and not to get off the subject too far, but it was a black tie event, and I was working as a speaker. I was out on the road, and I told them, look, I can't go home for a tuxedo, but they said, doesn't matter, come on in, it's fine. But they wanted the speaker there because they wanted the Speaker of the House there. And so I went to the dinner. They were pretty good supporters of mine. because I was the only person in the audience without a tuxedo, when Debbie Reynolds did her walk arounds and things, she spotted me. And someone said, that's the Speaker of New Jersey. Well, she came right on me. And Mr. Speaker, why don't you have the right clothes on? Don't they tell you you're supposed to dress? Don't you know? Don't you have a tuxedo? You know, she was really giving me a bad time. Then at some point, I forgot the circumstances. She extended her hand for me to kiss, and I kissed her hand, and I saw then her hand, her old poor old hand looks kind of like mine does now. And I thought, she's not the 20-year-old that I remember, 22-year-old doing Singing in the Rain, which was another big movie that she did, which was a great classic movie. So anyway, it's funny how some of those memories stay with you.
Well, that's a great story to sort of wrap up episode 2. Any closing thoughts before we conclude episode 2 of your life history?
No, that's through the 7th grade, and then the 8th grade became a major time when my dad was injured and was off work for an extended period of time, and caused a lot of hardship. But we can pick that up next time.
All right, Dad. Well, this has been fun. I've learned so many great things about you, and I look forward to episode 3.
So do I, Chuck. And take good care of yourself.
You
Keep
too.
6 feet apart. Love you.
We'll do. Have a good afternoon. Love you too, Dad. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.